Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Torah. This week we have the schus of reading parashas Tzav, and it seems to me that every year, it's not, God forbid, a problem with parashas Tzav, it's a problem with us. Parashas Tzav looks so much like parashas Vayikra that often we tell ourselves, okay, I don't know exactly where we are. We're still dealing with karbanos before the Mishkan was built, after the Mishkan was built, during the Yumei Miluim, after the Yumei Miluim. The details don't matter. But the details do matter, and Tzav and Vayikra are completely different. And it's possible to see this from just the first line or two of the Ramban on this week's parsha. Let's just point out, the psukim start as follows. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, Tzav et Aharon ve'et banav lemor, zo Torat, etc. Tzav et Aharon. If you go back to Vayikra, the parsha begins, Vayikra Moshe Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed lemor, daber el b'nei Yisrael va'amarta alehem. So why is Vayikra b'nei Yisrael and Tzav is Tzav et Aharon? What's the difference? So we know already. The difference in Vayikra is that we're telling b'nei Yisrael, these are the karbanos, these are the reasons why you bring the karbanos, these are the circumstances under which you bring the karbanot. First you have the karbanot nidava, then you have the karbanot chova. But in Parshas Tzav, it's completely different. In Parshas Tzav, we're telling the Kohanim, this is how you bring the karbanot. It's not a question of why, it's a question of how. And that's why you keep finding over and over again in the Parshas, Zo Torah Ha'olah, Zo Torah Ha'mincha, Zo Torah Ha'chatat, Zo Torah Ha'asham, Zo Torah Ha'shlamim. Right? And then there's sort of the concluding pasuk, Zot HaTorah La'olah V'la'mincha V'la'chatat, etc., etc. Right? It's all about the Torah. What's the Torah? The Torah is the procedure by which and through which you bring karbanot. That is completely for the Kohanim. I, Azar, don't have to know about Zrika. I don't have to know about Halacha. I don't have to know about Hova. I don't have to know about any of that. I don't have to know where you bring the karban. I don't have to know who eats the karban. But the Kohen needs to know that. Therefore, Daber al Aharon. And here's the Ramban. Amar HaKatuv b'Parashat Vayikra, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, Ki sham yitzaveh b'hava'at ha'karbanot, v'Yisrael mevi'im otam. Or said in my words, right? There, the topic is, for what purpose do I bring a karban? Therefore, it's addressed to the people who have to know for what purpose they bring the karban, namely, b'nei Yisrael. V'kan amar Tzav et Aharon, ki yidaber b'ma'aseh ha'karbanot, v'ha'kohanim yasu otam. Here, the person you're speaking to is the Kohen or the Kohanim, because here it's Zot Torat. I need to know the procedure. I need to know how I bring a karban. That has to be addressed to the Kohanim and not to Bnei Yisrael. Okay, so the first line of the Ramban kind of reminds us of the fundamental difference between Vayikra, why I bring a karban, under what circumstances I bring a karban, and Tzav, how I bring a karban. That's also reflected, we don't have time to do it, it's reflected in the order of Sefer Vayikra versus the order of Parshas Tzav. Okay. Now, there's an interesting pasuk, which has to do again with the process. It's the very second pasuk in the parsha. It says the Tzav et Aharon ve'et banav lemor zo Torah ha'olah hi ha'olah al mokdah al hamizbeach kol halayla ad haboker ve'eish hamizbeach tukad bo. Okay? There has to be a fire, ve'eish hamizbeach tukad bo. There has to be a fire on the mizbeach. Says the Ramban, Yomar shetukad ba mizbeach kol halayla ki mitzvah sheyasimu biyom eitzim harbe kidei shelo yitaklu legamre v'yichaber ha'esh mimanu. Says the Ramban, the Kohanim are warned, make sure you put enough wood on the Mizbeach during the day so that the fire doesn't extinguish itself or isn't extinguished overnight. Ulefi da'ati, says the Ramban, ma she'amar eish tamid tu kala Mizbeach lo tichbeh, right? There's a repetition here over and over again about the fire on the Mizbeach. So he says, no, Mitzvah la kohanim bikiyum ha'esh. That's a mitzvah on the kohanim that they have to make sure that the fire stays lit. Kemo shamar ubier ala hakohen eitzim. V'tziva sheyizharu bazeh v'ya'archu eish ve'eitzim harbe shetukad ha'esh tamid kol hayom v'chol halayla. Says the Ramban, the Torah is emphasizing that the responsibility for the fire to be lit on the Mizbeach at all times is a responsibility that rests on the Kohanim. V'hizhir b'lav shelo tichbe la'olam. Now there's a separate lo taseh. I, a non-Kohen, can't go onto the Mizbeach and extinguish the fire. If I do that, God forbid, I'm over a lo taseh. The distinction here in the Ramban, here, we'll keep reading a tiny bit more. V'hinei, im nit'atzlu hakohanim v'kavsa ha'esh, if the Kohanim were lazy and the fire went out, avru b'lav. They're over a lav. Therefore, the Torah says, Rabotenu shaita marechet shniya l'kiyum ha'esh. Therefore, there was a backup fire. Right? So machlokes in the Gemara, how many fires there were on the Mizbeach, 2 or 3. But l'chol hadeos, there's the eish tamid tukal Mizbeach lo tichbeh. Then there's like a backup fire that stays lit quietly on the side of the Mizbeach to make sure that if anything goes wrong with the main fire, there'll be a backup one. But the Ramban is trying to sort out the various mitzvos and the various lavim. And the Ramban's going to basically separate between the following. If anybody, including a Yisrael, including a non-Kohen, intentionally or accidentally extinguishes the fire on the Mizbeach, that's a lo taseh. But on top of that, says the Ramban, there's there's another lo taseh, that the Kohanim are required to make sure that there's enough wood on the Mizbeach, right? What we would say, what the Ramban calls bikiyum ha'esh, to make sure that it doesn't go out on its own. And I think the distinction is between the responsibility for the fire, for the eish tamid on the Mizbeach, rests with the Kohanim. The act of extinguishing the fire is prohibited for everyone. That's the difference. And it's significant to recognize, I'm prohibited from extinguishing the flame of the Mizbeach. Kohanim are required to make sure that the flame of the Mizbeach doesn't go out, right? That's a difference between the act is prohibited for me, but the responsibility rests with the Kohanim. Right? You have other mitzvahs like this, like Binyan Beis HaMikdash. Is it my responsibility to build it? It's Klal Yisrael's responsibility. Maybe it rests directly on the Kohanim, maybe it rests on all Klal Yisrael. Says the Ramban, there's a difference between the act, which is prohibited for me from extinguishing the Mizbeach, the fire on the Mizbeach, and the responsibility of making sure that the fire on the Mizbeach burns all the time, which rests on the Kohanim. Just as an aside, sometimes we get confused. We think that the Eish Tamid relates to the menorah, right? Where there may or may not, depending on your shita, have been a Ner Tamid. But the Eish Tamid, to Kal Mizbeach Lo Tichbeh, that's a Mizbeach then. The fire that can't be extinguished in the Beis HaMikdash, that's the Mizbeach fire. That's not the menorah fire. Okay. Next pasuk. Let's continue. Says the Torah, in the morning when you come to Beis HaMikdash, so there is the Kohen has to get dressed. V'lavash haKohen mido vad. He has to put on the appropriate sized big day kahuna. U'michnesei vad yilbash al b'saro. V'heirim et hadeshen. There's what's called haramat hadeshen, which is picking ashes up off the top of the mizbeach. Asher tochalo eshet ha'olah mizbeach. Right overnight, the top of the mizbeach basically is covered in ashes. V'samo eitzel mizbeach. Okay, so you take a klisharis and you put the ashes next to the mizbeach. Now our pasuk that we need. Ufashat et bigadav v'lavash bigadim acherim. So the Torah says, the way I read it at least, the Kohen has to take off his clothing. V'lavash bigadim acherim. Bigadim acherim is a strange phrase, right? If it's an avoda, they need to wear big day kahuna. right? If you do avoda without bigdei kahuna, it's pasul. And continues the pasuk, v'hotzia tadesh al michutz tamachaneh al makom tahar. Right? This is what we would think of lahavdil in your house as taking out the trash. Right? You pick up the deshen that's next to the mizbech, and you take it to the place where you throw it out. So there's really a shocking Rashi there, because the pasuk says ufashat et bigadav. That sounds like an imperative. The Torah is telling you, change your clothing. We'll come to v'lavash bigadim acherim, what that means. But ufashat et bigadav seems pretty clear. Says Rashi, ufashat et bigadav, ein zeh chova, ela Derekh Eretz. It's not a commandment. It's not an imperative. It's just Derekh Eretz. Derekh Eretz, defined as the way of the world. It's proper behavior. Let's call it that way. Shelo yilachlech bigadav. Says Rashi, the Kohen wants to treat his bigdei kahuna properly. So you know that if you're going to take out the trash, you're going to take out all the ashes, you're going to get dirty. Your clothing is going to get dirty. Shehu mishamesh bahem botzat hadeshen. So the Torah says to you, you don't want to get your bigdei kahuna dirty when you carry out the ashes. So therefore, it's a good idea, not that it's required, said Rashi, it's a good idea to change your clothing before him. And now Rashi has a famous parable, Bigadim shebishel bohan kidera l'rabo, right? The clothing that you cooked dinner, let's say you're a servant in a home, the clothing that you cooked dinner with, al yimzog bohan kos l'rabo. That's not the same clothing that you serve the food in, right? In the kitchen, you wear an apron, you cover yourself up, right? You don't look very good. When you come upstairs to the master's quarters, now you're wearing a tuxedo. I've seen it in movies. You're well dressed. You're serving the meal. That's how you pour the wine. So says Rashi, that's just common sense. That's good advice. Lekach amar v'lavash bigadim achirim pechutim mehem. You wear lesser clothing. Lashon Rashi. Okay, so again, even without the Ramban, it's kind of a shocking Rashi, because the Torah says, you shall. Ufashat et bigadav v'lavash bigadim acharim, which I think most of us would have read as, you have to take your clothing off. Says Rashi, no, you don't. It's just good advice. It's not the halacha. It's just anybody would know to do that. Now, says the Ramban, v'hakavana l'rabotenu b'zeh lomar. So he says, what Chazal mean is shahotzaat hadeshen tziricha bigdei kehuna ve'ein bigadim achirim bigdei chol. The Ramban is more focused on the second part of the pasuk. Ufashatet bigadav v'lavash bigadim achirim. Says the Ramban, Chazal don't mean to say that you can take out the deshen from the mizbeach without bigdei kahuna. It's an avoda. It requires bigdei kahuna, but the bigdei kahuna that you wear are lesser bigdei kahuna. What does that mean? It means if you go to the army in Israel, at least I assume the American army has this also, right? There's mada'e aleph and mada'e bet, right? There's kind of your dress uniform, and there's the uniform that you get dirty that you work in. Maybe they start to say, maybe they're not. But at some point, there's a big difference between those two sets of uniforms. So says the Ramban, you take off your mada'e aleph, your dress uniform, you put on mada'e bet, you're still wearing a uniform, but that's what you use to carry out the deshen to the place where you burn it. And when you get dirty, it's not as bad as, dirtying your dress uniform. Aval, says Ramban, lo yadati minayin amaharav sheino chova. But I don't get it, says the Ramban. Why would Rashi say it's not obligated? The pasuk seems to say that it is obligated. Ufashat et bigadav. How do you understand that if not as an imperative? Ki nireh shemitzvahi ala kohen shehabigadim sheyaseh bohem hakarbonot gam haramat hadeshen yiyu bigadim nikiim lo yishamesh ba'otan asher hotzi hadeshen. The mitzvah is, don't wear your nicest bigdei kahuna when you're taking out the deshen. That's reserved for actually bringing the carbon. V'hamitzvah miderech musar ha'eved l'rabo. It's true, says the Ramban. The purpose, the rationale for the mitzvah is musar ha'eved. Rashi's right. Anybody should know this. Anybody should know that kidera shebishel tavshil l'rabo al yimzog lo koso. Right? You don't wear the same clothing when you cook as when you serve. Ulekach yiyu lakohanim habigadim hachamudot la'avodot. So they have nicer big day kahuna to do real avoda. Va'apichutim la'otzaat hadeshen. And they have secondary big day kahuna, older big day kahuna. Maybe they rotate them. So the stuff that's almost going to be thrown out, they still have a din of big day kahuna. They're the ones that they wear for hotzaat hadeshen, for taking out the trash. V'chol zeh lefi asvara zo shekatav harav. That explains Rashi Shita. Aval yesh me rabotenu sham b'mesechet Yuma omer she'ein hotzaat hadeshen tzricha bigdei kahuna. But there's another Shita in that Gemara in Yuma that says, no, taking out the deshen, taking out the ashes that accumulated overnight doesn't require bigdei kahuna, which probably means it's not an avoda. V'yomar v'lavash bigadim acherim bigdei chol. Right, you take out your old ratty, Camp Torah Vidas t-shirt. That's what you change into to take out the trash. You don't want to get them dirty. Upshuto shel mikra b'kachu. Says the Ramban, the pshuto shel mikra seems to agree with this. Sheyitzaveh alav shelo yilachlech bigdei habad bigdei hakodesh ba'otzaat hadeshen aval yilbash bigdei chol. Says the Ramban, if I was just reading the pasuk without knowing anything, I would agree. I would say, pashates bigadav, that's mandatory. You have to take off your big day kahuna. V'lavash bigadim acharim, that's an old t-shirt. That's jeans. That's just, you got to take out the garbage. You don't want to get dirty. You know you're going to get dirty. It's a pile of ashes. So therefore, wear your own, secondary or lesser clothing, and don't get big day kahuna dirty. Okay, now to say that, you would have to say that taking out the deshen is not an avoda, which is a problem to say because it is an avoda. There are a lot of things in the Beis Hamikdash that look like menial tasks that are part of the avoda, right? The fact that the fire and the ashes on the mizbeach have to burn all the time, that's an avoda, as we saw in the previous pasuk, right? When Aaron complains in Baaloscha, not complains, the pasuk understands that Aaron was depressed because he didn't bring a carbon, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, no, the menorah, ashata madliku meitiv esaneros, part of that is cleaning. Part of that is menial grunt work. But that's avoda. That's what makes the Beis Hamikdash run. That's a zchus for us, right? And Aaron HaKohen knew that, and he kept that halacha. Okay? But here, I think the bigger point between Rashi and the Ramban, I just want to take a minute to point this out, is that Rashi thinks, okay, it's a level below obligatory. It's moral. It's Derekh Eretz. It makes sense. The Torah wants you to change out of your fancy big day kahuna to put on lesser big day kahuna. Says the Ramban, no, it's not a suggestion. It's a requirement. You have to do it. And, if I wanted to, I think I could point out that this is the Ramban l'shitaso. The Torah doesn't have things that it requires you to do and things that it doesn't require you to do. But if you're an intelligent person, if you're a moral person, if you're a sensitive person, you would do them. Right? Go to Kedoshim Tiyu, the most famous Ramban, which we'll do in a few weeks. The Ramban says, you don't want to be a novel b'rshus haTorah. Or, it's usher to be a novel b'rshus haTorah. Yes, the Torah doesn't prohibit you from doing something, but there are so many things in the Torah that tell you how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to behave, that at the end of the day, you know for sure. It's not that it's not recommended. It's prohibited, right? We like to think there are a lot of things that we'd rather not do, so we say, okay, it's not a halacha. For the Ramban, it doesn't work that way. The Ramban, similarly, on Va'asita hayashar v'hatov, the Ramban says, the Torah gives us enough information to tell us how we're supposed to behave in all situations, not in some situations. So for the Ramban, the Torah is much more binding than for Rashi. Rashi says the Torah tells you how you should behave. You'll draw your own conclusions. Pashadet begadav. I know it doesn't make sense to wear the same clothing, so I'm going to change my clothing if I want to. If I don't want to, I'm not in violation of the Torah. Says the Ramban, no. Pashadet begadav tells you the rationale is you don't serve your master in the same clothing that you cooked for him in because it's asur. That's the halacha. You don't have a choice. It's not a question of do I feel up to it or not, or am I a little lazy. Says the Ramban, that's the halacha. Fashadet begadav, you must change your clothing. The rationale is the same, but the result is slightly more binding for the Ramban than Rashi. That might be a lishitasam in many, many places in the Torah. Okay, let's do, I guess, a last Ramban, because we're going to run out of time, that really deals with the issue that we haven't talked about in a while, but it's the really the binding issue, the critical issue of the order of the parashos, of ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah, or yesh mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. And we're forced to do this, and the Ramban is forced to do this because there are difficult psukim at the beginning of Perek Chet, still in Parashat Tzav, obviously. Vayikra Moshe lemor, kachet Aharon ve'et banav ito, ve'et habegadim, ve'et shemen hamishcha, ve'et parachatat, ve'et shnei ha'elim, ve'et sal hamatzot. Okay, ve'et kol ha'ida hakel al petach al moed, vayas Moshe, etc., etc. When did this take place? So says Rashi, Parsha zo ne'emra shivat yamim kodem hakamat hamishkan she'ein mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah. That's Rashi, right? This parsha of taking Aaron and his sons and making them kohanim, etc., etc., was really done on the 23rd of Adar, right? So it had to have been done before this parsha. But it's reported here, says Rashi, because, ein mukdam muchar b'Torah, the Torah is not so focused on getting the chronology right. The Torah is focused on getting the substance right. And says the Ramban, in a way that is not really justified, because he's very worked up, and in the end he's kind of going to agree with Rashi. V'lama na'afoch divrei Elokim chayim, right? Why would you change the order? Why would you say that God's Torah, the Torah of the living God, is not chronologically correct? Va'od ki tziva beparshat b'yom hachodesh harishon b'chol hakamat hamishkan u'lebivishat Aharon u'vanav u'mishichat kulam v'siper sham ma'aseh Moshe binyan ha'hakama v'lo hizkir b'Aharon u'vanav davar ad hamakom hazeh. Says the Ramban in Perek Mem, in Pekudei, the Torah has all this stuff, but it doesn't have the stuff about the Kohanim. Ve'ech hifrish inyan echad b'shtei parshiot, ve'icher hamukdam. Why would the Torah have split the story of Hakamat HaMishkan to put the Kohanim here? It doesn't make sense. Says the Ramban, Aval hanachon shene'emar ki nitztava b'Hakamat HaMishkan b'chav gimel ba'adar ve'hikimoto. Says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded to build the Mishkan on the 23rd of Adar, and he did. V'tziva oto al ma'aseh karbonot kol ha'parshiot ha'ele shemitchilat Vayikra ad kan. Then, I'm sorry, I skipped a little bit. V'ka'asher amad al Mishkan al ma'amado miyad kara lo Hashem nitbarach shehu yoshev akruvim v'tziva oto al ma'aseh karbonot. Moshe Rabbeinu was told on the 23rd of Adar to put up the Mishkan. He does. Says the Ramban, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to him and gives him Parshas Vayikra and Tzav and tells him all the rules of the Karbanot, because Moshe has to know how to do the Karbanot for purposes of the week of the Miluim, before we get to opening day of the Mishkan, which is on the first day of Nisan. V'chol ha'parshiot ha'ele shemitchilat Vayikra ad kan, ki ratzah lamdo ma'aseh kol ha'karbonot u'mishpatehem kodem she'akriv mehem klal, ki yesh b'karbonot ha'miluim chatat ve'ola u'shlamim v'lo yida'o kol dinehem rak min ha'parshiot ha'ele she'iktim lo. So God had to tell him all of the details so he could know how to bring karbanot. Va'achar kach amar lo kachet Aaron vet banav ito lizarez oto bishat ma'aseh. Then God tells him at the end of Parshas Tzav, bring Aaron and his children and be mechanech them, right? Do chinuch on them. He had been told it already, but now God is urging him to do it at the time that he has to do. B'ma she'amar lo mitchila. V'zeh hadavar she'ta'aseh lem lekadesh otam lechahen li, v'hosif lo bikan ve'et kol ha'ida hakel al petach ol moed she'aseh b'ma'amad kulam she'yedu she'Hashem yitbarach b'achar ba'Aaron u'v'zaro. Now he's doing it publicly here in front of all of Bnei Yisrael, so Bnei Yisrael will know that it's not Moshe, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu who chose Aharon to be the Kohen Gadol, and who chose his sons to continue in his path. Okay, now the Ramban's kind of going to come back on what he said and tell us something interesting. V'al derech hayashar, the proper reading of the Psukim, he says, Nitztaveh Moshe b'melechet hamishkan kodem l'maaseh ha'egel. First of all, Moshe Rabbeinu got the mitzvah of building the Mishkan before there was an Egel. The Ramban still believes that's the case. That is Parshas Truma and Tzav. Ukishenitratza lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and when God forgave Bnei Yisrael, v'hifticho sheyashre shchinato b'tocham, yada me'atzmo shemitzvat hamishkan b'mekoma omedet. Right? After the Chet HaEgel in Parshas Kitisa, and Moshe begs, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu salachti kidvarecha, Moshe knows that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has now reinstated the mitzvah of the Mishkan. V'tziva liYisrael k'Moshe perashti, b'Parshas Vayakel. So that's Parshios Vayakel Pekude. That's Moshe telling Bnei Yisrael that they have to build a Mishkan. Va'acharei shehishlimu hamelacha, Ne'emar lo parshas bayom hachodesh harishon be'echad lachodesh takim et mishkan oel moed. Then the very last parak of Sefer Shmos is building the Mishkan, actually erecting the Mishkan. V'sham ne'emar lo v'hikravta to Aaron ve'et banav. And there he tells them the Kohanim should be Aaron and his children. V'hinei yada shegam Aharon uvanav b'ma'alatam u'v'chibatam lifnei hamakam. The result of that is just like we're building the Mishkan, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has confirmed to Moshe that Aaron and his children are forgiven also. Va'achshav chazar v'zerzam biyom harishon shel miluim uv'shas ma'isa. Now Moshe is urging them to do everything at the proper time. V'hinei kol ha'parshiot kisidran. Everything is in order except Ela shehiktim vayichas ha'anan et ol moed shu bayom shmini lemiluim kidat rabotenu l'sader kol inyan hakamat hamishkan ki kein derech haktuvim b'chol makom lahashlim inyan asher yitchil bo. Says the Ramban, everything is in order in the Torah except for the very, very last bit of Sefer Shmos. When it says Vayichas Hanan et Ol Moed Uchvod Hashem Alei et Hamishkan, right? That's just, says the Ramban, that's the end of the story. The Torah felt the need, and we know this from the Ramban's Hakdama and Sefer Shmos, the Torah felt the need not to interrupt the flow, right? Moshe is building the Mishkan, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to him and says to him, opening day of the Mishkan is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The Torah could have held off telling us what happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, but it couldn't. It wanted to complete that part of the story, according to Ramban, so that the Sefer ends with the return of the Shechina, right, with Hashras HaShechina amongst Bnei Yisrael. Okay, then it goes back in Vayikra and Tzav to sort of fill in what happened that week. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, once Moshe built the Mishkan on the 23rd of Adar, he had to take it down again, but once he built the Mishkan on the 23rd of Adar, God came to him, Vayikra Moshe v'daber elav all moed leimor, all of Parshas Vayikra, all of Parshas Tzav, leading us next week to kind of the end of this part of the Torah, which is Parshas Shmini, which is the story of the death of Nadav and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and sort of the end of Hakamat HaMishkan, the story of the 8th day of the Mishkan. That's next week. So basically today what we saw was the purpose, how Tzav is different than Vayikra. Upashadas begadav, this shocking Rashi, quoting the Gemara in Yuma, of course, that upashadas begadav is not a requirement to change out of your clothing. It's a suggestion. It's Derekh Eretz. And the Ramban's retort to that, which is, no, there's no such thing in the Torah. When you have Derekh Eretz in the Torah, it's a requirement. It's a commandment. It's an obligation. And finally, the Ramban that we just did, Kachat Aaron, where he explains the order of the parashot, starting with Parshas Truma, which happened before which happened before Chet HaEgel, to Parshas Vayakel Pekudei, which is real time, what happened after Chet HaEgel, and Vayikra and Tzav, which is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe during the days of the Miluim, when the Mishkan was already erected. That's it for today. Yashkoch to everybody. See you next week. Shabbat Shalom.